They laughed when I walked into my sister's lavish wedding wearing the simplest dress I owned. Their whispers cut through the air like daggers, making me question if I should have come at all. But everything changed when the Admiral took my arm and saluted me in front of everyone who had mocked me. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. The taxi pulled up to the sprawling estate, and I felt my stomach tighten as I paid the driver. 12 years in the Navy had taken me to 37 countries, but nothing made me as nervous as coming home to Georgia. I hoisted my duffel bag over my shoulder, the same one that had accompanied me through deployments and storms at sea, and stood for a moment, taking in the magnificent white columns of my family's ancestral home. The wedding preparations were in full swing. Ancient magnolia trees dotted the expansive lawn, their waxy leaves gleaming in the late afternoon sun. Workers scurried about, hanging fairy lights and arranging flowers that probably cost more than my monthly salary. A jazz quartet was warming up on the veranda, their melodies floating through the humid air as chandeliers were being adjusted to catch the perfect evening light. I hadn't even made it to the front door when my mother spotted me. She rushed over, her face a complicated mix of genuine happiness and immediate assessment. "You're finally here," she said, embracing me briefly before stepping back to examine my appearance. Her smile faltered slightly as she took in my travel-worn jeans and simple blouse. "We've got your room ready." The rehearsal dinner starts in 3 hours. As I followed her inside, the familiar scent of lemon polish and southern jasmine brought back a flood of memories. Not all of them pleasant. The house hadn't changed, and neither, it seemed, had the expectations that came with it. My younger sister was surrounded by bridesmaids in the main parlor, all of them giggling over champagne flutes. She squealed when she saw me, rushing over for an embrace that felt both sincere and performative. "You made it! I was worried your ship or whatever wouldn't let you come." "I'm stationed on land now," I corrected gently, but she had already turned back to her friends. Within the hour, my aunts and cousins had arrived, each making a point to comment on how military life must be so difficult for a woman, or how I could use some highlights to brighten up that regulation haircut. Their designer dresses and perfect manicures made me acutely aware of the gulf between us, not just in appearance, but in values. During dinner, I felt the weight of sidelong glances and whispered comments. Even in a crowd of hundreds of guests, I had never felt more isolated. My father offered a silent toast from across the table, the only acknowledgement that didn't come with judgment attached. That night, staring at the ceiling of my childhood bedroom, I wondered if I would ever bridge the gap between the officer I had become and the Southern belle they had expected me to be. My navy blue dress hung neatly against my body, its simple lines a stark contrast to the frills and flourishes that dominated the ballroom. I'd chosen it carefully, not to impress, but because it represented who I truly was. The fabric was quality cotton, breathable and practical, with a modest neckline and hem that fell just below my knees. It wasn't adorned with sequins or designer labels, but it carried the dignity I'd earned through years of service. As I stepped through the grand double doors into the estate's ballroom, the reaction was immediate. Conversations faltered mid-sentence. Heads turned. Whispers rippled through the crowd like wind through tall grass. I felt eyes scanning me from head to toe, lingering on my sensible flats instead of stilettos, my unadorned wrists where diamonds should have sparkled. "Is that what she's wearing?" I heard one of my cousins murmur to another, their voices deliberately loud enough to reach me. The clicking of high heels on marble seemed to punctuate their judgment, each tap a reminder that I didn't belong in this world of excess and appearance. My mother approached with practiced grace, champagne flute in hand. Her face was a masterpiece of controlled disappointment, lips pressed into a thin smile that didn't reach her eyes. "You could have tried harder," she whispered, leaning in as if sharing a confidence rather than delivering a blow. Her words sliced deeper than any insult I'd endured during my military career. This is your sister's special day. Everyone is watching us. I swallowed hard, fighting the urge to defend myself. I am trying, Mom. Just not in the way you want me to. She sighed, patting my arm with manicured fingers. At least you could have worn some jewelry. Or done something with your hair. From across the room, my younger sister caught my eye, her white gown billowing as she twirled for her bridesmaids. For a moment, her smile faltered when she saw me, quickly recovering as she whispered something to her friends. Their laughter erupted, eyes darting in my direction. My cousins huddled nearby, their designer dresses a rainbow of pastel silks and chiffons, their glances alternating between pity and amusement. One raised her phone, and I wondered if my fashion failure would soon be immortalized on social media. For the first time since arriving in Georgia, my resolve began to waver. The confidence I'd built through years of Navy discipline seemed to shrink under the weight of their collective judgment. Seeds of shame took root despite my best efforts to remain strong. I straightened my shoulders, a military habit, but inside, I felt myself becoming smaller with each passing minute. The wedding ceremony itself had been picture perfect. White roses cascading from magnolia trees, the bride glowing in designer lace, and the Georgia sun casting a golden haze over the entire affair. But as the reception began, my momentary peace shattered like fine crystal against marble. I stood near the open bar, nursing a glass of water while guests flooded the ballroom. My Aunt Margaret sidled up beside me, champagne flute in hand, her eyes narrowing as she assessed my attire. "Honey, did you mistake this for Sunday service?" she asked, loud enough for nearby cousins to hear. "That dress looks like something you'd wear to church, not your only sister's wedding." Laughter rippled through the small group forming around us. My cousins, all draped in pastel silks and designer labels, exchanged knowing glances. One of them snapped a photo with her smartphone, undoubtedly for their group chat. "It's Navy Regulation Blue," I explained quietly, though I knew my words would fall on deaf ears. "Well, at least you're consistent," another aunt chimed in, sipping sweet tea spiked with bourbon. "Always the practical one." The worst came during the toasts. My younger sister, champagne glass raised high, her wedding gown catching the light from the chandeliers, looked directly at me as she addressed her guests. "I want to thank everyone for dressing for the occasion," she said, pausing for effect. "Well, almost everyone. My dear sister always looks like she's reporting for duty, even at my wedding." The ballroom erupted in laughter. I forced a smile while heat crawled up my neck and burned in my cheeks. I gripped my water glass tighter, knuckles whitening as I fought to maintain composure. The same discipline that had carried me through naval training now keeping me from fleeing the room. Across the table, I spotted him, Daniel, my high school boyfriend who'd once promised we'd face the world together. Now he sat with his new wife, chuckling at my expense, whispering something in her ear that made her giggle while looking my way. The wound reopened instantly. Not just the rejection from years ago, but the betrayal of someone who once knew me, truly knew me, joining in the public mockery. "She's always been like that," I overheard my mother telling her church friends. "Never understood the importance of presentation. The Navy only made it worse." I swallowed hard, tasting bitterness. 12 years of service, 3 deployments, and countless commendations, all reduced to a punchline about my fashion choices. The ballroom suddenly felt suffocating, the air thick with judgment and the cloying scent of floral arrangements. I couldn't bear another minute of the thinly veiled mockery. Slipping away from the reception, I found myself drawn to the estate's garden, a place I'd loved as a child. The sticky warmth of the Georgia night enveloped me like an unwelcome hug, too close and too intense. Magnolias perfumed the air with their sweet, heavy scent, while fireflies pulsed in the darkness like distant stars, indifferent to human dramas. finding a stone bench partially hidden by azalea bushes. I sank down and finally allowed my composure to crack. Years of military training had taught me to stand tall under pressure, to never show weakness. But here, surrounded by family who should have been my strongest supporters, I felt utterly defenseless. My fingers traced the simple fabric of my navy blue dress. It was modest, practical, and completely me, yet somehow deemed worthy of ridicule by people who claimed to love me. The laughter still echoed in my ears, especially my sister's pointed joke during her toast. Even my mother's disapproving glances had cut deeper than any criticism I'd faced during my service. A firefly landed briefly on my hand, its gentle light a stark contrast to the harsh spotlights inside. "At least you don't judge," I whispered as it flew away. The truth was painfully clear in this moment of solitude. I desperately wanted my family's approval while simultaneously resenting their shallow value system. This contradiction had haunted me since enlisting, growing sharper with each promotion and achievement that went unacknowledged at home. I wiped away tears with the back of my hand, annoyed at my own vulnerability. In the Navy, I commanded respect. I made decisions that mattered. Yet here, surrounded by magnolias and memories, I felt reduced to the awkward girl who never quite fit the Southern Belle mold. The distant sounds of laughter and music drifted from the ballroom, reminding me that life continued without me inside. For all my military discipline and the armor I'd built around myself through years of service, I felt small and utterly alone. The strength that had carried me through storms at sea and tense international situations seemed to evaporate in the humid Georgia air. I took a deep breath, trying to center myself. Tomorrow, I would return to my real life, where my worth wasn't measured by the designer label on my dress or how well I played the social game. But tonight, sitting alone while my sister celebrated, surrounded by admirers, the gap between my two worlds had never felt wider or more impossible to bridge. I was alone on the stone bench, watching fireflies dance above the manicured lawn, when I sensed someone approaching. Looking up through tear-blurred vision, I recognized the tall, distinguished figure of Admiral Harris. His silver hair caught the soft glow of the garden lights, and despite being in formal civilian attire, he carried himself with the unmistakable bearing of a career naval officer. "Permission to join you, Lieutenant?" he asked, his voice gentle but carrying the natural authority that had guided countless sailors through storms both literal and figurative. I hastily wiped my eyes and straightened my posture. Old habits die hard. "Of course, sir." Admiral Harris settled beside me, his eyes taking in the elaborate gardens before speaking. "Your sister's wedding is quite the event." "It certainly is," I replied, unable to keep the edge from my voice. The Admiral had been more than just a commanding officer. During my early years in the Navy, he'd been a mentor who saw potential in me when others saw only a woman trying to prove herself in a man's world. His presence here, away from the mockery inside, felt like finding an ally in enemy territory. "You know," he said thoughtfully, "in all my years of service, I found that the people who judge others by their appearance are usually the ones most insecure about their own substance." I smiled weakly. "That's generous of you, sir. But it still hurts when it's your own family." The retired officer nodded, understanding in his eyes. Family can inflict the deepest wounds precisely because they matter most to us. We sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the distant sounds of laughter and music drifting from the ballroom. The Admiral's presence was calming, like finding a familiar port in a storm. "Would you do me the honor of walking with me back inside?" he finally asked, rising to his feet and offering his arm. His tone was gentle, but had that familiar note of command, not forcing, but guiding. I hesitated, the thought of returning to those judgmental stares making my stomach clench. But something in the Admiral's steady gaze gave me strength. Here was someone who valued me for my service, my discipline, my character, not my dress or makeup or conformity to Southern expectations. "I would be honored, sir," I replied, swallowing my embarrassment and standing tall. As I took his arm, I felt a small surge of courage. For the first time that evening, I was grateful for a moment of genuine recognition from someone who truly understood what it meant to serve, both country and self. Admiral Harris and I approached the ballroom entrance together, his weathered hand firmly placed on my arm. The confident stride of my mentor contrasted sharply with my own hesitation. The buzz of conversation and clinking glasses grew louder as we stepped through the doorway, the crystal chandeliers casting a warm glow over the celebration. As we entered, heads began to turn. My mother's eyes widened in surprise, her champagne glass frozen halfway to her lips. My younger sister paused mid-conversation with her new husband, her perfectly manicured hand clutching his sleeve. The bridesmaids, who had earlier giggled at my expense, fell silent. Admiral Harris guided me to the center of the room, his presence commanding attention without a single word. The retired officer stopped abruptly, turning to face me with the same serious expression I'd seen countless times during military reviews. What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion. The Admiral took 3 steps back, squared his shoulders, and with perfect military precision, raised his right hand in a formal salute. The sharp crack of his movement cut through the ambient noise like a thunderclap. The entire ballroom fell silent. "Lieutenant," he said, his voice carrying across the hushed room, "it's an honor to serve alongside officers of your caliber. My throat tightened as I returned the salute automatically, years of training taking over. The gesture felt both foreign and familiar in this setting of tulle and taffeta. For a moment, I was transported back to the deck of a Navy vessel, where respect was earned through action, not appearance. The stunned faces of my relatives reflected confusion, surprise, and, most surprisingly, a flicker of respect. My cousins, who had been so quick to judge my simple dress, now stood awkwardly with their expensive clutches, unsure how to respond. Even my mother's church friends seemed momentarily humbled. Yet as the warmth of pride filled my chest, a conflicting thought intruded. Why did it take an admiral's approval to make my family see me? The validation felt simultaneously powerful and hollow. I had spent 12 years earning respect through discipline, leadership, and sacrifice. Yet here, among my own blood, it took an outside authority figure to silence their mockery. As Admiral Harris lowered his hand, a smattering of applause broke out from a few veterans among the guests. The music slowly resumed, and conversations cautiously restarted. But something fundamental had shifted. The salute had transformed me from an object of ridicule to someone worthy of acknowledgement. I caught my father's eye across the room. For the first time that evening, he was looking directly at me, a complex mixture of pride and regret crossing his usually stoic features. The silence that followed Admiral Harris's salute was deafening. The clinking of champagne glasses and murmured conversations had evaporated, replaced by wide-eyed stares and dropped jaws. My heart hammered against my ribs as I stood there, caught between pride and discomfort at suddenly becoming the center of attention. "Who knew she was that important?" I heard someone whisper, their voice carrying across the now quiet ballroom. Old friends from high school who had barely acknowledged me earlier were suddenly gravitating toward us. Distant cousins who had snickered at my dress now straightened their postures, their expressions shifting from mockery to curiosity. It was as if the Admiral's gesture had transformed me in their eyes, from an oddity to someone worthy of respect. "I always knew she'd make something of herself," declared Aunt Meredith, who just 30 minutes earlier had asked me if I couldn't afford something prettier for the occasion. The Admiral squeezed my arm gently, before excusing himself to speak with some veterans at another table. His departure left me vulnerable again, standing alone in my navy blue dress that had been the source of so much ridicule. Across the room, my mother's face was a complex portrait of emotions. Her lips formed a tight smile, but her eyes betrayed a mixture of forced pride and unmistakable resentment. She nodded stiffly when people approached to compliment her on raising such a distinguished daughter, but I could see the tension in her shoulders. My sister, the bride, stood beside her new husband, her smile brittle as glass. What should have been her moment of glory had been briefly overshadowed, and though she raised her champagne in my direction, the gesture felt hollow. "Your commanding officer seems quite fond of you," my father said quietly, appearing at my side with 2 glasses of sweet tea. His voice carried no judgment, just a simple observation. I accepted the drink, grateful for his neutral presence. "He's been a good mentor." As the music resumed and the party slowly returned to its rhythm, I found myself in a strange limbo. The validation from Admiral Harris had silenced the mockery, but it hadn't healed the wounds already inflicted. My family's sudden shift felt performative rather than genuine, their respect contingent on external approval, rather than understanding who I truly was. I sipped my tea, watching the dancing couples and laughing groups. The public acknowledgement was meaningful, yet bittersweet. My sense of self-worth remained fragile, balanced precariously on the opinions of others rather than my own conviction. The Admiral's salute had changed how they saw me, but I still needed to change how I saw myself. The reception's glittering chandeliers cast long shadows as guests gradually dispersed. I found momentary solace in the relative quiet of the estate's east wing, away from the judgmental stares and whispered mockery. That peace shattered when my mother appeared at the end of the hallway, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor like a countdown to confrontation. "What were you thinking?" she hissed, cornering me against the antique sideboard. Her perfectly manicured hand gripped my arm. "You embarrassed me in front of everyone, especially my church friends." The venom in her voice stung worse than any drill sergeant's reprimand I'd endured during basic training. I stood at attention instinctively, my military training kicking in under stress. "I wore what I felt comfortable in," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "Comfortable?" she scoffed. "This wasn't about your comfort. This was about our family's reputation." Her words twisted inside me like a knife, reopening wounds I thought had scarred over during my years away. The woman who should have been my fiercest defender had become my harshest critic. Later, while retrieving my overnight bag, I overheard 2 bridesmaids laughing in the adjacent room. Through the partially open door, their conversation froze me in place. "Did you see her face when Admiral What's-His-Name saluted her?" one said, mimicking the gesture mockingly. "God, she looked so pathetic," the other replied, like she needed some old man's approval to feel important. My cheeks burned as I learned the bridesmaids had deliberately coordinated their designer dresses in shades that would make my navy blue outfit look even more plain and out of place. My sister had known, had likely orchestrated it. That night, alone in my childhood bedroom, my smartphone buzzed with notifications. My cousin Melissa had posted photos from the wedding, tagging me in the most unflattering angles. The comments beneath were brutal. "Military chic or just cheap?" And "Someone tell her this isn't boot camp." Even relatives I'd considered allies had joined the digital pile-on. I shut off my device and stared at the ceiling, the glow of Admiral Harris's respect now dimmed by this new wave of humiliation. The mockery had transcended the physical space of the wedding. It now lived online, immortalized for anyone to see. My private shame had become public entertainment. Sleep eluded me as I wondered how the discipline that had earned me respect in the Navy had somehow made me a target in my own family. The estate felt more like hostile territory than home, and I found myself longing for the simplicity of my barracks thousands of miles away. The weeks following my sister's wedding stretched into a month of deafening silence. I returned to Washington, D.C. with my phone notifications muted, unable to face the barrage of messages from relatives who had laughed at my expense. Some texts were thinly veiled attempts at reconciliation. Others were outright demands that I get over it. I archived them all unread. My mother called exactly 3 times. The first call, I let ring until voicemail. The second, I answered but remained silent as she complained about my embarrassing behavior at the reception. The third, I declined with a swift tap of my finger. The freedom of distance allowed me to breathe again. The hardest part was my father's silence. Not a call, not a text, just the same emotional vacancy that had characterized our relationship since my childhood. I found myself staring at his contact information on my smartphone, thumb hovering over the call button before putting the device away. His absence felt like a physical ache, a void that no amount of Navy discipline could fill. At work, I threw myself into my duties with renewed intensity. My colleagues noticed the change, but knew better than to pry. Only one fellow officer, who had seen the viral photos of me at the wedding, dared to ask if I was okay. I managed a tight smile and changed the subject. Evenings were the loneliest. In my apartment, surrounded by medals and commendations that meant nothing to my family, I sometimes wondered if I should have just worn something flashier to the wedding. But the thought made me angry all over again. 12 years of service, of leadership, of saving lives, reduced to judgment over fabric and style. My sister sent an album of professional wedding photos. I noted with bitter amusement that I appeared in exactly 3, always at the edges. My navy blue dress, a stark contrast to the pastel palette everyone else wore. The message was clear. I didn't fit their aesthetic, their world. One night, after a particularly difficult day, I found myself drafting a long email to my entire family, pouring out years of hurt and disappointment. I wrote about the mockery, the judgment, the constant feeling of being measured and found wanting. But when I reached the end, my finger hovered over send for a full minute before I deleted the draft entirely. My pride wouldn't let me beg for their approval. I had faced storms at sea and enemy fire. I would not chase after people who measured worth by designer labels and social conformity. If reconciliation came, it would be on equal terms, with mutual respect. Until then, silence would be my shield. 3 weeks of silence felt like 3 years. My smartphone remained eerily quiet, with only occasional work messages breaking through the digital void I'd created between myself and my family. Each notification made my heart jump, then sink when it wasn't the apology I both craved and refused to ask for. Then, on a rainy Tuesday morning, an email arrived from Commander Jacobs, an old Navy friend who'd served with me on 2 deployments. "There's a veterans fundraiser in D.C. next month," she wrote. "They need speakers with authentic stories. I gave them your name." My finger hovered over the delete button. Public speaking had never been my forte. I preferred action to words, service to spotlight. But something in her follow-up message caught my attention. "Your story matters." Not just the Navy part, but all of it. People need to hear from someone who stands tall even when it hurts. I called her that evening, my voice hesitant. "I'm not sure I'm the right person for this, Jacobs." "You're exactly the right person," she insisted. "Look, this isn't just about raising money. It's about showing people what dignity looks like when it's earned, not borrowed." After our call, I sat on my apartment balcony, watching the city lights flicker on. Washington, D.C. was only a 3-hour drive away, close enough to feel accessible, far enough to feel like an escape from Georgia and all its painful memories. I accepted the invitation the next morning, then immediately regretted it. What would I say? How could I distill 12 years of service and a lifetime of family complexity into a 15-minute speech? The familiar knot of anxiety tightened in my stomach. The same feeling I'd had before my first deployment, before my sister's wedding, before every moment that demanded I step into the spotlight. I drafted and redrafted my speech, deleting more words than I kept. My apartment became a sea of crumpled paper and half-empty coffee mugs. The fundraiser was 2 weeks away, and I still couldn't find the right words to explain how it felt to stand alone in a room full of family, or how Admiral Harris's simple gesture had cut through years of dismissal. Each practice session in front of my bathroom mirror ended with me staring at my reflection, wondering if I was brave enough to be this vulnerable in public. The Navy had taught me to face enemy fire, but facing strangers with my personal truth felt infinitely more dangerous. Yet beneath the anxiety lay something else, a quiet certainty that this invitation had arrived precisely when I needed it. This wasn't just a chance to speak, it was an opportunity to reclaim my narrative on my own terms. The day before I was set to leave for Washington, D.C., my father knocked softly on my bedroom door. His weathered face appeared in the doorway, eyes downcast in that familiar way that always made him seem smaller than his actual height. "Thought you might want to go fishing before you head out," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Like we used to." I hadn't been fishing with him since high school, before I enlisted. The invitation surprised me, but I nodded, grateful for the distraction from my pre-speech jitters. We drove in silence to the riverbank, the Georgia humidity wrapping around us like a thick blanket. The water moved lazily beneath the morning sun as my father methodically prepared our fishing gear, his hands moving with practiced precision. "Your mother doesn't know I'm here," he finally said, casting his line into the water. "She's still processing everything." I cast my own line, focusing on the ripples spreading across the surface. Processing that her daughter isn't a social embarrassment anymore? He winced at my words, but didn't deny them. Instead, he looked directly at me for what felt like the first time in years. "I've always been proud of you," he admitted, his voice cracking slightly. "Everything you've accomplished, your strength. I just never knew how to say it, especially with your mother and everyone else." "You were afraid of their judgment," I finished for him. He nodded, shame coloring his features. "I failed you." Every time they laughed or made those comments at the wedding, I should have stood up, should have been like that Admiral of yours. The confession hung between us, imperfect but honest. A small fish tugged at my line, but I ignored it, too focused on this rare moment of vulnerability from my father. "I'm sorry," he continued, "but I want you to know, before you go give that speech, that someone in this family has always seen you, even if I was too weak to show it." His words weren't a complete healing, but they were a start, a tiny bridge across years of silence. As we sat there, occasionally reeling in small fish and releasing them back to the river, I felt something shift inside me. The knowledge that support existed where I least expected it gave me a strange new confidence. When we packed up our fishing gear and headed back, my father awkwardly patted my shoulder. "You'll do great in Washington," he said. "Just be yourself." That tentative connection, fragile as it was, became an unexpected source of strength as I prepared for the fundraiser. Perhaps family wasn't just those who celebrated you publicly, but also those who quietly believed in you all along. The chandeliers of the Washington, D.C. venue cast a golden glow over the crowd as I adjusted my uniform one last time backstage. My palms were slick with sweat, my heart hammering against my ribs. This wasn't a battlefield, but somehow facing this audience felt just as daunting. "You've got this," whispered Lieutenant Commander Melissa Jenkins, my old Navy friend who'd arranged my invitation. Her steady presence grounded me, just as it had during our deployments. These people are here to support veterans like us. When my name was announced, I stepped into the spotlight, blinking against the brightness. Hundreds of faces turned toward me, military officials, donors in expensive suits, journalists with notepads poised. I began speaking about resilience, about the brotherhood and sisterhood forged in service. The words flowed easier than expected, my Navy training kicking in despite my nerves. Halfway through the question period, a journalist from the Atlanta Journal stood. There are rumors that you faced ridicule at your sister's wedding recently because of your simple attire. Would you care to comment on how that experience relates to the challenges female veterans face when returning to civilian life? The room fell silent. My throat tightened. I hadn't expected this private humiliation to follow me here. I gripped the podium edges, considering deflection, but something inside me shifted. Yes, I said, my voice growing stronger with each word. I chose a simple navy blue dress for my sister's wedding. It wasn't designer, it wasn't extravagant, and yes, I was mocked for it. The audience leaned forward collectively. But that dress represented something important to me, the same values I carried through my military service: practicality, dignity, and substance over show. I paused, remembering the sting of laughter, the burn of shame. When Admiral Harris saluted me that night, he wasn't just honoring my service. He was recognizing that true respect isn't earned through expensive fabrics or conforming to others' expectations. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Several veterans nodded in understanding. That dress became a symbol of the disconnect many of us feel when returning home. I continued. We come back changed, with different priorities and perspectives. Sometimes our families don't recognize who we've become. By the time I finished speaking, the room had transformed. What began as an ambush question had become a moment of authentic connection. Several audience members wiped away tears, and the applause afterward felt different. Not polite, but profound. As I stepped away from the microphone, Melissa squeezed my shoulder. "That wasn't just good," she whispered. "That was necessary." The local news coverage of my speech at the Veterans Fundraiser in Washington, D.C. caught me completely off guard. What began as a small segment on a D.C. channel somehow made its way back to Georgia, where it was picked up by our hometown station. Within 48 hours, the video had spread across social media platforms like wildfire. My smartphone buzzed constantly with notifications. People I hadn't spoken to in years suddenly remembered our connection. My high school English teacher sent a warm message saying she always knew I would make something of myself. Even Jessica and Melissa, cousins who had snickered behind their hands at the wedding, were now sharing the video with captions like, "So proud of my brave cousin," and "always knew she was special." The irony wasn't lost on me. These were the same people who had whispered about my plain appearance and lack of effort just months earlier. Now they were claiming me as their own, as if my public recognition somehow reflected on them. The most surprising message came from Aunt Patricia, who had been particularly vocal about my dress choice at the wedding. "I always told your mother you were going places," she wrote, conveniently forgetting her earlier criticisms. I stared at her message for several minutes before simply responding with, "Thank you." Admiral Harris called to congratulate me, his voice carrying the same steady confidence that had comforted me in the garden that night. "You've given voice to something important," he said. "Don't let the sudden attention distract you from what matters." He was right. While the notifications continued to flood in, I felt strangely detached from the praise. The validation that once seemed so important now felt hollow compared to the journey I'd been on. My father's quiet words by the riverbank meant more than 1,000 social media comments ever could. My mother sent a clipping of the newspaper article, her note simply reading, "People at church were impressed." Even in her attempt at connection, she couldn't help focusing on appearances. My sister texted a brief, "Saw your speech. You looked good on camera," which was as close to a compliment as she'd ever given me. As I sat in my apartment in Washington, watching the view count climb on the video, I realized that public recognition wasn't the healing I had sought. The journey towards self-respect had already begun that night in the garden, when I decided that others' opinions of my worth wouldn't define me. The viral moment wasn't my victory. It was just an echo of something I had already won within myself. My smartphone wouldn't stop buzzing. The same people who had snickered behind their hands at my sister's wedding were now falling over themselves to reconnect. Aunt Deborah, who had loudly compared my navy blue dress to something from a thrift store, sent a saccharine message about how, "We've always been so proud of you, dear." My cousin Melissa, who had orchestrated the bridesmaids' coordinated mockery, suddenly wanted to meet for coffee to catch up on old times. I scrolled through the notifications with a mixture of disbelief and bitter amusement. The irony wasn't lost on me. How quickly judgment transformed into admiration when public opinion shifted. My mother had called 3 times, each voicemail more strained than the last, her voice oscillating between pride and resentment as she mentioned how everyone at church is talking about your speech. Sitting in my Washington, D.C. apartment, I deleted most messages without responding. The validation they sought to give now felt hollow, tainted by their previous cruelty. I remembered the sting of their laughter, the heat of shame that had crawled up my neck as they whispered about my appearance. Those wounds wouldn't heal with a few convenient text messages. My father, in his characteristically brief way, had simply texted, "Saw you on the news. Well done." His message, unlike the others, didn't ask for anything in return. There was something refreshing about his simplicity, a quiet acknowledgement without the desperate need to rewrite our history. As rain tapped against my window, I found myself reflecting on what I truly wanted from my family. Not their approval. I'd long since stopped measuring my worth by their standards. Not their admiration. That came too late and too conditionally. What I craved was something more fundamental. Respect. Not the kind that came with viral videos or public recognition, but the kind that acknowledged my choices and my journey without judgment. I picked up my device and typed a response to my father. "Thanks, Dad. Maybe we could go fishing when I'm home next." It was a small olive branch, extended to the one person who seemed to understand that reconciliation couldn't be rushed or forced. For the others, I decided to let time be the test. True respect couldn't be demanded or manipulated. It had to be earned and freely given. The Navy had taught me patience in the face of storms, and this was just another kind of tempest to weather. On my own terms, in my own time, I would rebuild the connections worth saving and let the others fade into the background where they belonged. My phone buzzed with my sister's name on the screen. 3 weeks after the viral speech, she was finally reaching out. I hesitated before answering, the memory of her wedding joke still raw. "I saw your speech," she said, her voice lacking its usual confidence. "You were amazing." The silence between us stretched uncomfortably. I waited, letting her fill the void she had created. "I never thought I'd say this," she continued, "but I envy you. The way you stand on your own, how you don't need anyone's approval." Her voice cracked slightly. "Do you know what it's like to wake up every morning wondering if you're good enough?" I sat down on my apartment couch, surprised by her vulnerability. "I thought you had everything you wanted. The perfect wedding, the perfect husband, the perfect life." She laughed, but it wasn't her usual melodic sound. It was hollow. "Perfect for Instagram, maybe. But my marriage," she paused. Don't get me wrong, I love him. But sometimes I wonder if I married him because he was what everyone expected. The right family, the right connections. And that's not enough? I asked. It's exhausting, she admitted. Every day is a performance. The right clothes, the right friends, the right opinions. I saw you in that navy blue dress, completely unbothered by what anyone thought, and I was jealous. The revelation stunned me. All those years I'd spent thinking she looked down on me, when actually, she'd been looking up. Remember when we were kids and you built that treehouse by yourself? She asked. Mom was furious you ruined your dress, but Dad couldn't stop bragging about how you did it all alone. I smiled at the memory. I didn't know you remembered that. I remember everything about you, she said quietly, how you always knew exactly who you were. Even when we were cruel at the wedding, you never broke. The conversation remained tense, years of misunderstandings impossible to erase in one call. But beneath the tension was something new, honesty. I'm not saying I'll suddenly start wearing simple dresses and joining the military, she said with a small laugh, but I'd like to learn how to care less about what others think. It takes practice, I told her, and courage. As our call ended, I realized something had fundamentally shifted. My sister no longer saw me as competition or an embarrassment. For the first time, she saw me as someone to learn from, someone with strength worth emulating. The validation I'd once craved from her now felt different, not because I needed it less, but because it finally came from a place of genuine respect rather than obligation. Thanksgiving in Georgia had always been a sacred tradition in our family, as immutable as the changing seasons. This year, I made the decision to return to the estate, not to prove anything to anyone, but simply to reclaim my rightful space at the table. After much deliberation, I chose to wear my Navy uniform, not as a spectacle, but as a quiet statement of the pride I carried in my service. The drive up the winding gravel path to the family estate stirred memories both bitter and sweet. Fall had painted the Georgia landscape in amber and gold, and the familiar silhouette of the house emerged through a veil of morning mist. I parked my vehicle beside several others already there. My mother's luxury sedan, my father's pickup truck, and my sister's new convertible. Gifts from her lavish wedding still evident in her lifestyle choices. As I approached the front door, the scent of roasted turkey, cinnamon, and pecan pie wafted through the air. My father answered my knock, his weathered face breaking into a tentative smile that carried more warmth than I'd seen in years. You came, he said simply, stepping aside to let me in. The interior of the house was exactly as I remembered. Polished hardwood floors, family portraits lining the hallway, and the sound of crackling logs in the grand fireplace. My mother emerged from the kitchen, wiping her hands on an apron, her expression in a careful mask of neutrality. You're wearing your uniform, she observed, her tone unreadable. I nodded. I am. A moment of tension hung between us before she nodded back. Dinner will be ready in an hour. The living room was already filled with relatives, aunts arranging flowers, cousins setting the table, and my sister helping with final preparations. Their conversations dimmed as I entered, eyes darting to my uniform and then away. The atmosphere was charged with anticipation. Everyone waiting to see how I would present myself, how I would navigate this delicate reunion. My younger sister approached, looking elegant but subdued compared to her wedding day extravagance. I saved you a seat next to Dad, she said, gesturing toward the dining room where the massive oak table had been extended to accommodate everyone. Place cards marked each setting, and true to her word, mine was positioned beside our father's at the head of the table. The family gathered slowly, filling the space with cautious small talk. I caught my reflection in the ornate mirror hanging in the dining room. Straight-backed, composed, my uniform a shield and statement both. This Thanksgiving would be different. The mockery that had once cut so deeply at the wedding now seemed distant, replaced by something that felt almost like respect. As everyone took their places, I realized this wasn't about revenge or validation anymore. It was about standing in my truth and allowing my family the chance to see me, truly see me, perhaps, for the first time. The clinking of silverware against china had just subsided when my father rose from his seat at the head of the Thanksgiving table. His weathered hands trembled slightly as he raised his glass. The dining room fell silent, the warm glow of candles casting shadows across faces that had once twisted with mockery at my sister's wedding. "I'd like to propose a toast," he announced, his voice stronger than I'd heard in years. "To my eldest daughter, who has served our country with honor and dignity." To my astonishment, every family member stood, even my mother, whose critical gaze had softened into something unfamiliar. Aunt Meredith, who had whispered about my drab appearance at the wedding, now looked at me with unmistakable respect. My cousins, once gleefully sharing photos to ridicule my navy blue dress, raised their glasses with expressions of genuine admiration. I remained seated, my heart pounding against my ribs. The memory of their laughter echoed in my mind. The pointed jokes, the sidelong glances, the way my sister had used my military bearing as punchline during her reception speech. Part of me wanted to reject this sudden reverence, to question its authenticity. "Your commitment to service," my father continued, his eyes meeting mine across the table, "reminds us what truly matters in this world." The crystal glasses remained suspended in air, waiting. I felt Admiral Harris's lessons about grace under pressure resurfacing. Slowly, deliberately, I rose to my feet, straightening my shoulders as I had done countless times on duty. "Thank you," I said, my voice steady despite the emotion threatening to break through. "But I need everyone to understand something." The room tensed. My mother's smile faltered. "I'm grateful for this recognition," I continued, "but I won't be respected only when it's convenient or fashionable. I am who I am, in uniform, in a simple dress, or standing here today. That doesn't change based on public opinion or social media attention." My sister lowered her eyes, perhaps remembering her own confession of envy about my independence. "So I accept this toast," I concluded, finally raising my glass. Not as validation, but as acknowledgement that we can move forward, together, with genuine respect for our differences. My father nodded, pride evident in his misty eyes. The family clinked glasses, the sound ringing through the dining room like a promise. As I sipped my drink, I realized this wasn't surrender or forgiveness. It was reclamation. I was taking back my place in this family, but entirely on my own terms. The clink of glasses faded as the formality of my father's toast melted into something more genuine. Laughter. Real laughter. Not the kind aimed at someone's expense. Rippled through the dining room of our family estate. The warmth from the crackling fireplace seemed to mirror the changing atmosphere among us. My Aunt Eliza, who had once whispered loudly about my dreadful sense of style, approached me with hesitant steps. "I'd love to hear about your experiences," she said, her southern drawl softened by what seemed like genuine interest. Not just the headlines, but the real stuff. The woman who had once judged me most harshly now leaned in, listening as if my words actually mattered. Two of my cousins joined us, their champagne glasses half empty, but their expressions open. They asked questions about my naval career, not to fill awkward silence, but with curiosity about a life so different from their own. One admitted she'd always thought military service was just for people with no other options, her cheeks flushing with embarrassment at her former ignorance. Across the room, I caught glimpses of my younger sister, watching these interactions with a mixture of surprise and something that looked like respect. She gave me a small nod when our eyes met, a silent acknowledgement of our earlier conversation about independence and strength. The most unexpected moment came when my mother pulled me aside near the antique sideboard that had been in our family for generations. Her fingers nervously traced the wood grain as she struggled to find words. "I've been wrong," she finally said, her voice barely audible above the dinner chatter. Not just about the dress or the wedding, but about so many things. It wasn't a perfect apology. Decades of expectations and disappointment couldn't dissolve in one evening. But the sincerity in her eyes told me this was more than social performance. I didn't respond immediately, letting the weight of her words settle between us. Then I simply reached for her hand and squeezed it once, firmly. Some wounds would take more than words to heal, but this was a beginning. As the evening continued, I noticed how differently the air felt in our family home. Warmer, lighter somehow. Conversations flowed more easily, less burdened by pretense. My father caught my eye from across the room and raised his glass slightly, a private toast between us. For the first time in years, I wasn't an outsider in my own family. They were finally seeing me, not as they wished I would be, but as I truly was. After the emotional toast and reconciliation with the family, my father caught my eye across the room. With a subtle nod toward the porch, he silently invited me to join him. I excused myself from my aunts, who were now genuinely interested in hearing about my naval experiences, and followed him outside. The Georgia night embraced us with its familiar warmth as we settled into the wicker chairs on the family estate's wraparound porch. Crickets chirped in rhythmic chorus, and the scent of magnolias hung heavy in the air. For several minutes, we sat in comfortable silence, something that would have been unthinkable just months ago. "Remember when I taught you to fish at Miller's Pond?" he finally asked, his voice soft with nostalgia. I smiled. "You were so patient." I tangled my line 6 times before catching anything. 7 times, he corrected with a chuckle. "But you never gave up." The conversation flowed more easily than it had in years. We reminisced about early morning fishing trips, the secret spots where the bass were always biting, and the quiet lessons he'd imparted between casts. Those memories had been buried beneath years of tension and unspoken words. "I should have stood up for you," he admitted, his eyes fixed on the distant tree line. At the wedding, every day before that, I let silence become my habit. "Why didn't you?" I asked, not accusingly but with genuine curiosity. My father sighed, running weathered hands over his knees. "Fear, I suppose. Your mother has strong opinions about how things should be. The family has expectations. I was afraid of rocking the boat." "But you went fishing with me before Washington," I reminded him. "That was my first step toward courage," he said. "Watching you stand your ground made me realize what courage really looks like." We talked about his pride in my service, his regrets about our distance, and his hope for our future. The conversation wasn't perfect. We stumbled over words, paused awkwardly at times, but it was honest in a way we'd never been before. As the night deepened around us, I realized this quiet moment on the porch meant more than any public validation ever could. His support, no longer hidden behind silence, had become the foundation for something new between us. When we finally rejoined the family, something had shifted. I carried myself differently, not because I changed who I was, but because I finally understood that belonging doesn't require conformity. In the warm glow of the Thanksgiving lights, I found what I'd been searching for all along: acceptance on my own terms. The final night at my family's estate felt different, like the air itself had shifted. Laughter echoed through rooms that once held only judgment, and conversations flowed with an authenticity I hadn't experienced since childhood. My father stood beside me, his hand occasionally touching my shoulder, a gesture so small yet profound in its meaning. "You've changed this family," he whispered as we watched my mother and sister arguing playfully over the last slice of pecan pie. Not by becoming what they wanted, but by refusing to. I smiled, remembering the navy blue dress that had started it all. The mockery had transformed into something unexpected, a catalyst for genuine change. My younger sister caught my eye from across the room and raised her glass in a silent toast, her face free from the competitive tension that had defined our relationship for decades. As midnight approached, I helped my mother clear dishes from the dining table. Her hands, always so quick to point out my flaws, now worked alongside mine in comfortable silence. "I was wrong," she said finally, not looking up from the china plates. "About so many things." The words weren't perfect, but they were honest. And in my family, honesty was rarer than diamonds. When morning came, I packed my bag for the return to Washington, D.C. The fundraiser had opened doors I never expected, creating opportunities to advocate for other veterans. Standing on the porch, I breathed in the Georgia air one last time, savoring the scent of magnolias and redemption. My father appeared with car keys in hand. "I'll drive you to the airport," he offered, his voice gruff with emotion. The drive was quiet, filled with the unspoken understanding that had grown between us. As we approached the terminal, he cleared his throat. "That Admiral, the one who saluted you, he saw what we should have seen all along." I nodded, throat tight with emotion. "And now?" "Now we all see it," he replied simply. Walking through the airport, I felt lighter than I had in years. My revenge against those who had mocked me wasn't in humiliating them or making them small. It was in standing tall, in finding dignity on my own terms, in refusing to shrink myself to fit their expectations. As the plane lifted off, I watched Georgia disappear beneath me. The journey had come full circle, from a simple dress to a profound realization. I had finally reconciled my need for family with my unshakable sense of self. The Admiral's salute had been a catalyst, but the real victory was mine alone. Respect earned, not demanded.